everyone, and welcome. My name is Matt Hawkins, and I am Chief Communications Officer of the Global Compassion Coalition, and I am delighted to be chairing what I know will be a vital and moving conversation about how, through speaking and through spreading and embedding compassion, we might spark the mindset shift necessary to mitigate climate breakdown. Joining me for this discussion are four wonderful people who, through politics, activism, and research, are helping to inspire that shift. Each of them is going to introduce their view and perspective for around 5 minutes before we turn to questions and debate. So enough from me. Let me introduce you to our first panelist, Zane Wedding. Zane is based in New Zealand, where he works for the Kindness Institute. He previously worked for Greenpeace and lectured at the Manukau Institute of Technology. Welcome, Zane.
Tēnā koe, and tēnā koutou e ngā iwi katoa. Kia ora e te iwi, he reo no Ngāti Pikia, no Ngāti Kuri Huki, ko matawhaura te maunga ko Rotorua Nui a kahu mata moimoi te moana, ko Zane Wedding toku ingoa. My name is Zane Wedding. I descend from a small mountain in Rotorua, a tiny little place in New Zealand. And that's probably the best way to frame and introduce myself. There's an old whakatauki from within our culture, which is ko au te whenua, ko whenua ko au. I am the land is me. And that kind of connection, that interconnectedness that like I actually come forward with, I will always introduce myself as the mountain that I descend from. That mountain is connected to the water that I descend from. I am the whenua, I am the ocean. There is an interconnectedness between everybody. But I'm also a worker. I work for the Kindness Institute at the moment with youth, trying to spread the whakaaro of connectedness to nature, to the rangatahi, to the youth within New Zealand. And prior to this, I was actually working for Greenpeace Aotearoa for a couple of years on the activism front, heading up kind of the actions portion of Greenpeace in New Zealand. So the people who actually go out and run the protests, that kind of nature. Prior to that, I lived in a tree for a year, trying to defend a small grove of trees within Auckland. Auckland has some of the lowest tree percentage canopy in the whole of the world within urban environments. And what's really important is like, that's where this disconnection from nature for people within urban environments begins. It's when you start to strip away nature from within the locations where primarily there are so many Indigenous cultures living, and they are stripped away of what they actually are connected to the most, which is the manu, the birds, the rako, the trees, the whenua, which is the land. And that's kind of me, whānau. There's an amazing quote that I always like to think of in spaces like this, and I would like to say it's a real honor to be able to be here and represent my tupuna, my ancestors, and my culture. To be Indigenous, to be Māori, to be speaking in this forum is incredibly important to me, because Indigenous voices need to lead in these places. We have been harmed the most. Climate change is a product of colonization. And because of that fact, we've been impacted the most by colonization. We need to be the ones who lead the way forward into navigating a path for the betterment of all of those who were impacted by colonization. So it's an honor for me to be here. Surrounding the compassion thing, there is a quote which I always like to go to when in activism, like movements, and it's something like, if you came here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you came here because your liberation is tied to my liberation, then let's get together, because we have work to do. And that's what this is all about for me, whānau. Compassion is this like acknowledgement of everybody's struggle together. And that's what I'm here for. I did not come to help. I came here because all of our struggles are tied together. And if you can see my struggle and I can see your struggle, we all have this work to do. Climate change is going to affect anyway, all of us. Nō reira, nei rā ka mihi kia koutou. Thank you very much to everyone. That's me, whānau.
Thank you, Zane. That was wonderful. I'm going to now turn to Caroline. So I just need to do my quick introduction. Caroline was elected as the first ever Green Party of England and Wales Member of Parliament in the UK, in Britain, in 2010. And she has gone on to be the recipient of many prizes for her, both for her work as an MP and an advocate for climate action. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Matt, and a real honour to be here, and particularly an honour to follow Zane. I really loved what you said about I am the land and the land is me. I can't wait for us to get into that big discussion, because I'm really involved in things like trying to extend what we're calling the Right to Roam campaign here in the UK, and trying to make the point that people need to be reconnected to the land in order to know who we are and to feel rooted, and to get involved in all of the battles that we face. So it's very exciting to be here. In terms of reflecting on the issue of compassion, I guess I would simply start by saying that I think the future has to be compassionate, that the science couldn't be any clearer, that human and planetary well-being are inextricably linked, that the only livable future is one where our actions and our thinking are fully aligned with that reality. In the time that I have, I wanted to focus on the role of politics in all of this, and how and why it needs to change if we're to have a hope of reaching that livable future. And I think we are all aware of the pressures that regular election cycles place on decision makers, the compelling need for policies that show benefits quickly, the difficulties that creates for addressing longer term challenges. And of course, the climate crisis is a really obvious example of that, with decades of delay between today's emissions and the full impacts in terms of global heating. The glacial pace of climate action, I think, shows that economies and political systems the world over are failing to show compassion both to current generations and indeed future generations. And I think we have to do a lot better than that. So the case I would make is that we have to recognize that the climate and nature crisis is a democratic crisis as well, and that to respond to both, then we have to radically transform not just our economy and our society, but also the relationship that exists between citizens and the decision making that shapes our lives. Democracy isn't something that we can take for granted, something that we win and then just bank forever. And if we were in any doubt, then recent history here in Europe and further afield, I think, should serve to remind us that we must actively defend democracy every day and resist those who would dismantle it. Doing that demands being on the offensive. I'd say that the corrosive effects of an electoral system in which millions of votes don't count, which is the case here in the UK, where we have this horrible first past the post system, those consequences of apathy and anger and disengagement among millions of people, I think that's been building for some time. People's voices have not been heard, and first past the post, and with it the complacency and the safe seats that it's delivered, I'd say is as much an attack on our democracy as cronyism or corruption. Here in the UK, you'll know that we had the infamous Brexit referendum, and during that referendum campaign, people were essentially asked if they wanted to be part of the EU or not, but many of them understood that question to be, should the country go on being run in the way that it is? And they answered no with a collective howl of rage. And that response was justified then, and it's justified now, because despite the musical chairs at the top table, we still have a government in which promises are routinely broken, where corruption and bullying and rule breaking are a normal part of the fabric of political life. Every time the Prime Minister betrays the trust and responsibilities of office, then they strike a further blow to our democracy. So I think let's make sure that the ecological emergency is also a clarion call to strengthen our institutions, empower citizens, reform parliamentary as well as voting systems, deliver and defend the rule of law, create new frameworks that promote cooperation and peace, and yes, compassion. I think we have to make democracy something we actively do, not something that's just simply done to us. And we start by giving people votes that count, and communities' agency over the transformation that the climate crisis demands. Changing our relationship with politics is about the opportunity to bring out the best in humankind rather than the worst. A politics that enables a culture of blame or insecurity or fear doesn't serve us well. We are better than this. And we saw that during the height of the COVID pandemic, when so many people did make sacrifices to make our communities safe. We did see compassion. We relearned the value of community, of connection, of the natural world, of the positive change we can affect locally and globally with our choices. So compassion and cooperation and courage are the values that hold us together in times of disaster. So my plea for today is, let's make sure that we put them at the center of our politics, not just in times of disaster, but at all times. And they need to be at the center of our response to the climate and nature emergencies. And as we inspire a kind of societal-wide shift towards ways of living that promote human and planetary well-being, let's remember something else that we've learned, and that is that, frankly, when government accepts that there's an emergency, it can find the money it needs to spend. There's no shortage of money, there's no shortage of technology, there's no shortage of science. There is a shortage of political will, but political will is a renewable resource, and it's something that with compassion, we can make sure we develop into the future.
Thank you, Caroline, and really looking forward to furthering that conversation about the politics and the ways people can get involved too. Now we turn to Kevin Riordan. Kevin is doctoral student and research assistant at the Center for Healthy Minds, University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses, amongst many other things, on the relationship between mental and behavioral health and the climate crisis. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Matt. And yeah, tough acts to follow. Such beautiful eloquence from both Zane and Caroline. Yeah, I think when I reflect on several points I was going to hit in there, but what I can speak to of the heart right now is, in my lifetime, and again, how I'm seeing even this week, how little tolerance and compassion exists in our ability to hear each other's points of view across differences, and the degree to which we have become so divided from one another, from communities, from individuals, and certainly from nature. And I think the kind of dehumanization that has come with that is really, really problematic. And as Zane pointed out, this is not new, right? This is what this dehumanization, going back to colonialism, capitalism, slavery, this is where resource extraction has sort of emanated from. And so we have these current systems that we're faced with in our individual behaviors. You know, a lot of the research, this is a lot of the worlds that I occupy these days, is focusing on research, and we design these studies that are really born out of a way of, there are particular tools that are really useful in terms of looking at and measuring in a particular way in certain kinds of knowing. But really interested in individual behavior change, like how do we get people to act more pro-environmentally and change our behaviors? And it's really born out of this hyper-individualistic kind of lens. And we have our individual behaviors very constrained by these systems that we're operating in that don't make a lot of room for humanity and justice. And so I think in struggling against that, we have, you know, these archetypal myths of like the hero's journey and the kind of struggling against this, you know, almost, you know, this force of evil, right? We can really feel very justifiably like we are combating, as we are, right? The forces that are sort of raping and pillaging our very source of wholeness and being as a planetary ecosystem. And I think in some ways that is, while understandable, also can be dangerous in some ways when I'm interested in this idea of fierce compassion, right? This idea that, like, you know, that anger has a place and can be channeled, and I think it's really dangerous in the mindfulness and compassion movements when we're presenting these ideas as sort of passive acceptance and just kind of breathe through it. And this is, I think, really damaging. And so I'm interested in this idea of fierce compassion. Well, what is the place for anger when we talk about compassion? What is the role of compassion in direct actions that are necessary to disrupt these systems? And so I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about it with such a sort of diverse range of perspectives and life experiences and wisdom. I think that's the one thing I'm most excited about this group and the work of the Global Compassion Coalition. I think when we think about ecosystems, it's adaptability and diversity that lead to flourishing of any ecosystem. And that's what we're really lacking in these conversations, in the science that's being done, in the politics and the conversations and who gets to have them. And so it's really an honor to be here with you all. So I'll stop rambling on. That was none of what I was going to say. I had bullet points.
It was all wonderful nonetheless, Kevin. Thank you. We're really glad you're here too. And then finally, I'm really pleased to introduce Hindou Ibrahim. Hindou is, and I need to double check I've got this right, Hindou is Indigenous Women and Peoples, from the Indigenous Women and Peoples Association of Chad, and also served as the co-director of the World Indigenous Peoples Initiative and Pavilion at COP 21, 22, and 23. Hindou.
Thank you so much, Mathieu, and it's really a great pleasure being with all of you here and hearing a different perspective from my brother from Indigenous peoples, Maori in New Zealand, to the politicians and to the research. But as an Indigenous woman coming from a developing countries and coming from the Indigenous communities who are the most impacted by climate change, it is so hard to think about compensation. I mean, and just like think about how people can understand that, how they can understand the fear of being under flood, the fear of being under drought, the fear of also how your community can wake up and just losing their land, losing their identity, losing their culture, and living in certain way of the future. So it's really very hard that for me to see how people can just understand that and how they can react, how they can act about it. So I think when we talk about the climate change, we need to understand the differences between who create the climate change, how they are thinking that they are going to resolve it, and who are experiencing the first hand of the climate impact. So as an Indigenous woman, I assume that all my Indigenous brothers and sisters that are coming from the various ecosystems, from the desert to the mountain, from the islands to the glaciers, we all having the same thing. We are all thinking that the Mother Earth is alive. And that's why we have as duty to protect the Mother Earth. Doesn't matter that people think they have to use the resources as commodities, but for us, it is not about the commodities. It is not about the politics. It is how we can keep the balance of the ecosystem there. So for me also, living on this climate impact, it's how we can put a climate justice in the heart of every single actions from the politics. When the politicians taking the decision, they must think about what is the roles by fighting climate change, but what is the role also by playing that is stopping the climate change to be increased and impact the other peoples, because it is an issue of justice. It is an issue of access, issue of rights. So you cannot just focus like the politics in the next 5 years, but you can think about the next 50 years, the next 100 years, as how Indigenous peoples are thinking. When you think about the research, how the research can include the very old knowledge of our grandmothers, grandfathers that pass it through the generations, the Indigenous people's traditional knowledge on how we can protect the nature, how we can live in harmony with the nature, how we cannot just not extracting from the nature, but we are giving back to the nature. We take only what we need. So how the research can include that, can respect it, but by recognizing it is a knowledge who are very old than science and technology, who is still useful for the solution of the climate change. And finally, when we talk about the climate change, we have to put in our mind we are in the urgency. I'm always saying that I don't know when people are going to understand our urgency where we are on need. We are already in my country, Chad, on plus 1.5 degree. We are experiencing all the extreme weather events now, all the food insecurity, all the water scarcity. We have all the face of the climate impact. Until when the people is going to understand this urgency, and they're just going to say like, oh, we are really understand that. We have to act. But like act. Stop saying that you understand what I'm living. Stop saying that you understand what my communities are living because of the climate change. Just to act to take me out from this. And climate change do not have a frontiers. Now, maybe we are most impacted, but it is a matter of time with all what is happening around the fires, around all the floods around the world. It's going to be a matter of time. You can be rich, you can be in developed nations, you can be hit by climate change, whether you like it or not. So if you cannot act for me, act for yourself, act for your children. So that's really the talk I wanted to put here with all my fellows, and we can see how we can find maybe some ground of accelerating action. That's what I'm looking for.
Thank you, Hindou. Absolutely, amen to that. So I'm going to go to my questions now, but also throughout this, just put questions to each other, as I said, and I'm going to start with just individual questions, picking up on some points you raised, but if you have views that you want to throw in, do that. Don't feel it has to just be directed to one person. So Zane, I was going to start with you. You mentioned about this disconnect that has emerged between people and nature, and I wondered if you could share with us your sort of view on how that process has happened. How have we got to this position where we're at? And I appreciate that it's different for different communities and different cultures, but nonetheless, if you can do a sort of summary of your perspectives there, that would be really helpful to ground us.
Yeah, for me at least, you know, the disconnection to nature is directly connected to kind of the commodification of nature. Like when the colonizer came to New Zealand, the process was definitely to kind of diminish our mātauranga, our knowledge. And this was a knowledge that was totally based in kind of us having our place within that ecosystem, within nature, to not be a dominating force, but just to be one with Papa Tuanuku, to like Mother Earth, as most people would understand it. And slowly, as that kind of knowledge has dissipated, has been extinguished, our focus has become far more centered around like, what can we have now? What do we own? And those concepts were just like not a part of our culture. Like those of so many indigenous cultures all around the world, and that slow kind of extinguishing of that knowledge, and then the uptake of this kind of capitalist model has been what's led to people leaning towards this and not that. And then you just have all of this, you know, when the trees and nature disappears from around you and you don't have that connection to nature, you no longer have the connection to people. That is just a byproduct of all of that. And so you're far more willing to stand on your brother for the betterment of yourself. Whereas like the philosophy within Te Ao Māori is like rangatiratanga. True leadership was shown through how much you could share, how much you could pass out and amongst your communities. There was no need to resource kind of hoard. That was not a part of our community. If you went to and fished from the oceans then it was shared amongst everybody. So everybody, and that extinguishing of that type of culture has led to the culture that we have now, where it's all about hoarding what you can have for yourself. That has led to a kind of extinguishing of the compassion within our communities. And that is a big part of the kind of mindset that is leading towards this climate catastrophe that we're faced with.
Thank you, Zane. And Caroline, from the opposite side of the world, how much of that do you think rings true for the similar sorts of engagement or disengagement problems we might be seeing here?
I was really struck with what Zane was saying about disconnection, and I'm struck by the fact that in the UK we are apparently one of the most nature disconnected countries in the world. In other words, people just don't feel that intimacy with and respect for and part of nature. And we are also at the same time one of the most nature depleted countries. So our nature is most destroyed. You know, we are wrecking it more. And it feels to me like those two things are connected. You know, there is a reason why we are destroying nature. And I think you could make quite a strong case to say that it's those lovely words, actually, they're not my words, but the writer Richard Lew, a US writer, wrote a wonderful book called Last Child in the Wood, where he said something along the lines of, we won't protect what we don't love, and we won't love what we don't know and touch and feel and see and hear and feel part of. And I think that's so important. And what I'm trying to do in politics here is to put people back into nature. Yes, we need to restore nature, of course we do. And there are all the kind of targets that we sign up to at all of these different UN meetings and so forth. But if we keep locking people out of nature, then they're not going to feel that sense that what they're doing to nature, they're doing to themselves. And so just to take one little example that I mentioned at the very beginning, having a bigger right to roam, in other words, a right to be in the land that is ours, feels so important. In England right now, we have a legal right to roam on just 8% of the land, and the rest of it has barbed wire and fences and things to keep us out. And I think that unless we respectfully, and there needs to be education and all the rest of it, of course there does, but unless we become part of that wider nature and feel that that's part of our home, then I do worry that we won't protect it, and that we won't, pick up what Hindou said, do it fast enough either, because there is such a thing as being too late. In the wonderful words of Bill McGibbon, you know, winning slowly is losing when it comes to the nature and climate crisis in particular.
Thank you, Caroline. I do want to move shortly to thinking about what people can do, because there'll be lots of people out there who I would imagine really want to get involved in supporting different initiatives. But Kevin, you brought up the issue of fierce compassion and anger, and there's sort of a two-part question here for you, which is one about people's sense of overwhelm at the face of climate breakdown and climate chaos, and what you can tell us about research that's been done on that. Both, I'm quite interested in the effect we know that it's starting to have on people, but also approaches to maybe relieving that or dealing with it. And then I wondered if you could just say a bit more about the role of anger, and, you know, as Hindou has said, this need for action and justice, not just concern and understanding.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. And big ones. Yeah, no, answers are not quick to come by to those. But I think on the first part of your question around the overwhelm, it's terribly overwhelming. And I think that's showing up. I mean, it's related to your question about anger too. I think it's showing up very, very differently in the emotional and psychological responses that different people are having. I think that people in the majority cultures and more in the Northern Hemisphere are more likely to feel things like fear, anxiety, grief, guilt, tremendous amount of guilt and shame, and things that it can be kind of less activating of actual, they're less motivating emotions often. Whereas I think that kind of there's a role, especially in younger generations, where anger is becoming more and more of a facet of people's response. But what I think part of why I think it's so overwhelming is the scope of it, obviously, right? So there's this term in psychology that I think is relevant here of pseudo-inefficacy. This idea that this belief that my actions don't matter. And it's a cognitive bias that a lot of us have in a lot of contexts, and it plays out all the time here. And I think partly also related to the fact that people don't know what to do. I don't think people know the scope of the problem is so big, and most of the actions that we have before us, because we're so constrained by these systems, are so small. Like what I can recycle my plastics, like that, like we know that that has little to no actual, well, I shouldn't say no, but it has, in the grand scheme of behavioral changes that are needed, it has, yeah, we can say little to no effect on what actually needs to happen to change the effects that Hindou is describing is happening to her community on a daily basis and so forth. So I think there's this cognitive dissonance that can arise in people who believe that we're environmentalists, us in the majority culture. We believe we're good environmentalists. We care very deeply. Our values are very aligned with stewarding the land. Maybe we feel very connected with nature, some of us. And yet the constraints on our individual behavior change that we have, and in some cases our willingness to make really radical behavior changes that we do have options to make, is really hard to hold. And so I think if I'm going to hold these values and not take these actions, whether because the conditions don't allow me to, or whether because I'm going to choose not to when it comes to transportation methods and so forth, that's a difficult tension. And I think a lot of people can experience, right, climate anxiety, climate grief, terrible depression can come out of this. I think I've clinically, I mean, talk about my research a lot here, but I mean, I'm a clinician as well. This is very common, especially in younger folks. So I think, we have some responses. There's some ways that we can handle that. On the one hand, we could kind of give up our values and just say, okay, this is the way I'm living. And, then that cognitive dissonance between who I am and who I want to be. Okay, that's one way to resolve it. Another way to resolve it is to radically change who I am and how I'm living. Again, it's really, really difficult. We have to kind of opt out of capitalism. At this point, that's really, some people do. And I'm talking about people in the majority culture who that's hasn't been how we were raised, right? We'd have to really be divorcing ourselves from our entire sort of way of socialization and the systems that we exist within. And that's really difficult for people to do. So I think the opposite, the third option is I just don't think about it very much anymore. And that's a way to kind of resolve this tension too. And so we get this kind of retreat into not quite apathy, but this kind of like, it's so overwhelming that people kind of can tune out and turn off. And I think, yeah. And I think that coupled with, you asked about psychology, the last thing I'd say is another one that comes to mind is we know in I think people that are involved in philanthropy know this a lot. Researchers also know this. There's this like warm glow effect where people are a lot more willing to donate, for example, to one child who's starving of hunger. But when you present people with an entire, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who are starving, they become less likely, on average, people become less likely to donate because the scale of the problem is so overwhelming that the gratification of helping, or the belief that my action's helping, and that kind of warm glow, the feeling of my compassion matters, can be so much less. And so, I think about the kinds of stories we can tell, and when we really humanize this and put it into the individual communities, the people that are being affected, the people that my actions can affect for the positive. I think that's one way people not only to hopefully invite more behavior changes, but to your last question of how can we grapple with the psychological distress that comes out of all this. I think in liberation psychology and other theorists in this field who are dealing with, how do we, for instance, deal with other kinds of oppression in systems that we have very little agency within? Well, we can increase our agency and find ways to take action, even on a very local scale, and increase my sense of efficacy to do something locally. And not only is that more powerful as a narrative that can change hopefully bigger systems, but it helps me feel more resilient and connected with my community at the same time, which hopefully, I think of the Desmond Tutu, always talked about, it's just a drop in the ocean, but the ocean is made up of just drops of water. And so I think that, communities and individuals and stories about them can be really compelling to address these things that I've been rambling about.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. And after a question for Hindou, I'm going to come to that point of action. So if everyone's thinking of those sorts of examples that you can bring, or sort of places you can point to, ideas you can point people towards, again, it's going to be different for different cultures and countries, but I think people will really appreciate that. But Hindou, before then, you've obviously represented your organization at various international conferences. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what you've learned through that about interacting with global leaders, what their responses have been, where you may have had success, I suppose, in influencing them, what you've learned from that, or if there hasn't been too much success, to talk about why you think that might be, and where we're moving in terms of the sort of international coordination on this issue.
Sure, but I wanted to link it with what Kevin said earlier about really the mind. And being at the international level, talking about the reality on the ground, it's so heavy. I believe that you understand that, Kevin. It's really very heavy. Morally, mentally, that I know what is happening on the ground, what the peoples are experiencing, what they need. And when I come to the international level, people talk and they argue just to in full stop, in karma, in the negotiation. And I just like say, are they understanding what peoples are experiencing? Are they understanding what they are talking about? Are they willing to get an action to resolve the climate issue, or they just wanted to show how much they know how to write this sentence? They wanted to argue about full stop and comma. So what you said is really resonated with me. If people do not feel that personally, or they do not live that, they do not understand how morally it can be very impactful, how your mind can be very sick because of the inaction of others. But however, yes, I attend many international negotiations. And the reason why I keep going to those meetings, to those conferences, because it is the only way to make the voice of my people, of many other indigenous peoples, to be here. It is the only way that to make them think about they are not the master of the world. They have to take the decisions by thinking about the peoples who are not there. They may be taking the decision today, but those who are home must get the power on these decisions. So I give you some examples. As the COP26 held it in Glasgow, so for the first time of the history, the head of state come together on the 2nd of November, saying that indigenous peoples are the solution, they do have the solution. Let us commit some funding to help them protect their land and forests. So they committed 1.7 billion for indigenous peoples solutions. For us, of course, it was a big celebration. It was a big accomplishment because we come together, we asked for it, and now the head of state are understanding. But the disconnection between commitment and the real actions is a big gap. When we went to the COP27, just in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, so they come to say from the 1.7, 100% of it, they already give it 19% of this money. And from the 19% of it, only 7% went to the indigenous peoples. The 93% went to the big NGOs, to the UN agencies, to the government. And that's make us like, fine, how it's come that you put all indigenous peoples in front. You make all your video, your audio, your statement, it is the money for indigenous peoples because we are the solutions. And only 7% went to the indigenous communities. And even we do not know to whom exactly. So that's mean it's a big disconnection between what they are saying and what they are doing. So international level are understanding now we are the guardian of the ecosystem. We are the solutions. maybe they're also thinking how they are, I don't know how they are feeling, but how they can be in a compassion with us, but they are not acting as we are asking them urgently. So this is the two disconnection that I'm seeing just very recently between COP26 and COP27. But however, it is not only at the climate negotiation that we have to talk about the climate change, about the role of the indigenous peoples and about the actions. But it is in the daily life of the government, of the company, that we wanted them to take a right decisions. So how the companies and the government can work together. When you take the examples of the big polluters, Shell, Total, or whatever oil companies, they are have the nationality of one country. They have their headquarters. But seems like it is not the government who is deciding, it is them who are deciding. So they cannot just go to the indigenous people, say like, protect the forest, protect the land, without telling to the companies, stop digging the land, shift to the renewable energy. They must tell them in a very fast way that they are telling the indigenous peoples to protect the land. So they must take their own responsibility at the international level. They cannot continuously giving us like lesson that we have to protect 80% of this forest, 90% of this land, or whatever, giving all the numbers without saying, you who are digging the petrols, you have to stop digging the petrol right now. You who are mining, you have to stop mining now. We have the solutions. The renewable energy are more cheaper. Then it's not me who's saying that, they are the one who are saying that. If it is much cheaper, why they cannot shift there very quickly and now, very radically? So that's what we want. It is going out from their boxes in a very comfort zone and talk clearly with a concrete action. I'm so tired hearing from them. They say, oh, let us make a process of getting out from this fossil fuel. They make the process, we still having the greenhouse emissions that going up and up. We still experiencing from the drought to the flood in every single life of us. This process is not working. So they have to get out from their comfort zone and just to go talk clearly to those who are polluting, and they take the right legislations, they act on the ground. And then we know they are working with us. Otherwise, it's not making sense to use the name of the indigenous peoples without doing any action for the indigenous communities.
Absolutely, thank you, Hindou. So turning now, I suppose, to how we create that urgency of action, and as Caroline said at the outset, create that will that we so desperately need. I'll let anyone come in when you're ready to, what your thoughts are on. And I suppose this works on multiple levels, because there's obviously communities and people and cultures, then there's the politicians or the companies, as Hindou points out, and there's education here, there is preparing yourself and your mental well-being for the crisis as well. So any actions, any aspects that you would like to touch on, and as I say, I'll let anyone come in when you're ready to.
I wanted to ask Caroline about that, because what she said, it also resonated to me. You say that if you do not care about something, you cannot protect it. If you do not love it, you cannot protect it. That's how indigenous peoples love all the species of the nature. We give them all rights, right to our rivers, to the forest, right to little insects, to the birds. We love them, and then we give them the right and we protect them. So how really, like, politicians can make that change? I know it's very hard, but you are trying. So I really will love to hear more from you about that. And sorry, Matthew, I have really to jump on it from what she said.
Well, thank you so much, Hindou. That's kind of you. And you're talking about giving rivers rights makes me think that's exactly what we as Greens are doing right now. I mean, we are learning from you. We are miles behind you, but we're starting. And so, for example, I have some colleagues in a town just up the road from where I live, and they have just passed a resolution at their council meeting that they will start the process of giving their local river rights, its own rights, because at the moment that river is polluted, it is sewage, it is not cared for. And this is a way, you know, the efforts at regulation haven't worked. The water companies are basically ignoring what people have tried to do so far. So this is a new way of approaching it by trying to indeed harness some of that indigenous wisdom and say, what can we learn from that? And if we treated a river and nature as a whole as something that had rights, then maybe that could change the mind frame and the policies that then flow from it. And obviously you need enforcement policies, you need all of that as well. But I'm just excited that it feels like we are beginning to learn from that. And you'll know of other examples. So for example, the Green Party is very much behind the idea of a new UN law on ecocide, which would be to prosecute big bosses of companies that are basically destroying the earth, and to find the kind of political tools that we can use to hold people to account. Because in our system so far, as we know, the richer go on getting richer, and they do it at the expense of the poorest, and they do it at the expense of nature. And I don't know what is going to be the best way ultimately to change things. I mean, that's something that I think about all the time. You know, is it through community action? Is it through big NGOs? Is it through the political system? And I guess none of us actually know the answer to that question. But it feels to me that the more that we can be sharing our experiences and coordinating and trying to work together, somehow that combination, I hope, will bring us where we need to be. But I have to say, particularly as I'm the only Green Party MP in my parliament, so I'm a bit of an endangered species myself. And I don't know if the party political system is going to be the best way to bring change in the time frame that we need. But I do know that learning from Indigenous peoples and from what's worked in the global South, I think that can give some inspiration to those of us in the majority cultures who need to change fastest.
Yeah, I want to jump in to follow up on this, but then also to I'd love to hear more from Zane and Hindou maybe on this, to bring it back to this question of anger and like what can be done when the problems facing us as a global community are impacting some differently than others in pretty dramatic ways. And I think about, I was an audience member in a conversation that a number of people were having, but Thupten Jinpa, the longtime translator for the Dalai Lama, was as involved. He's a tremendously wise and compassionate person. And he was talking about this idea of like, what is the role of anger? And he had made this interesting analogy of, I hope I get this vaguely right to represent him, but around compassion in some cases being like going to visit your physician in a preventative health way, that we need to build bridges, we need to create more compassionate cultures, we need to find ways to hear and listen to each other and understand each other. And at some point in time, if a wound is deep enough, if a trauma is deep enough, if there's an illness, it may come time for a surgery. There might actually be other tools that are needed to sort of save the health of the body. And so I wonder about this, and I wanted to put it back to those of you that I think, I mean, on this call, there are some of us that are being more impacted than others, and where anger may be more salient and important in terms of protecting yourselves and your community. So the nature of this conversation of compassion and the Global Compassion Initiative, what do you make of this? Sort of how do we hold, when we hear in Buddhism, we talk about fierce compassion, this idea that like we can say no to injustice, and sometimes that may even involve very aggressive action. And yet the motivation for doing so is so important. So in Buddhism, we talk about intention and motivation being potentially even more important than the actions they're taking. So, you know, that I do this because I love all of us and you need to stop, being very different from that kind of like other kind of anger that can happen. So I'll stop talking, but I wanted to put that out there.
Happy to jump in there. Like rage has brought me to many a movement, but it's that kind of anger that brings me there, that when I put that anger into action, like fierce compassion into action, it's actually really therapeutic for me. It's quite healing, no matter what the outcome is, to actually confront yourself and be like, this is like what my white or my spirit is telling me to do. These are the things that are causing me, and actually stand against it. There is healing in that. And so often it has been kind of that anger that has brought me into that place. It has been the fire that has driven me to take action. But once taking action, there's a healing to that, and you kind of understand that there is far more power in the calmness that you can bring in that, because anger can always be translated into being perceived as something really, really negative. But it's often my anger that brings so many people into that space. And it's, for me at least, it was not taking action when my internal voice was telling me, man, someone needs to do something about this, and I wasn't the one who was. That was like poison for me. You know, it was like ingesting poison. But the moment that I took that fierce compassion kicked into actual action that was tangible, that I was doing something, I just felt so powerful. And that is an idea that is shared with so many people in the movement. And it doesn't really matter what walk of life you come from. I might be fighting for land rights, and someone else might be fighting for climate change, or whatever it might be. But the fact that they have put their truest voice into reality, that is like so therapeutic for people. And that is like a real key change for getting people to kind of, it's that fire that we can all be forged in together. And once you're all together, there is a healing there that allows us to move in a much more kind of compassionate way without the anger. Yeah, the action has been so therapeutic for me in that way. It has brought out a much kinder side to me. However, very often when I've come into those spaces, it's been because of like a rage that is inside of me to do something. Not listening to that voice is one of the most harmful things that I can do for myself and the planet at the moment. My thoughts.
Thank you, Zane. And I'm going to bring in Hindou. After this, we will have to wrap up because I know a couple of people have got to leave on the hour. So the final words are with you, Hindou. So respond to any element of that from Kevin, and also this sort of what people can go and do after this.
Yeah, so firstly to Kevin, I think hunger between who create the climate and who are impacted can be received in two ways. So the first way, from us who are fighting just to protect our land, because we know that the Mother Earth is alive. So we use this hunger, as what my brother Zane here said, to turn it into an opportunity to fight more, to get more action, to be facing all those who are destroying the land, destroying the nature, and telling them that you have to act, and then showing them by examples because we are acting. But in the other hand, this hunger with many people coming from the developing nations, what they say it is not my responsibility. Those who create it must act. So I have the right of using all the resources as they already use it. Then I will do it. Either we die altogether or either we survive altogether, because they are not understanding. So this two way, you need to get a balance between the two. You need to understand those who are hungry and who wanted also to use all the resources because they find themselves, they are behind, and others are taking all the opportunity. So you need to understand this way, and then give them the recompensations in order to also get the level of the development that they want, of the access to the justice that they want, etc. And those who are as indigenous peoples who are using the hunger, turn it into action, protecting the nature, and understanding this one, invest on this pathway. So I think by taking the two way and having the middle side, that will help us to turn it in a positive compassions to all, both sides, not only compassions because you are most impacted or it's too pity, I have to act, but because I'm going also to do my part. But of course, I wanted to end my message here by saying that everyone have a role to play, and everyone must play the role very, very quick. As we don't have time, as we say the proverb, if you go alone, you can go very far, very fast. But if you go with the peoples, you can really go slowly, but you can go very far. But how we can go very far, very fast together? So that will be the most important. So everyone have the role to play. Politicians must take the responsibility to change the right legislations, to hold the accountables all the bigger companies that they are under their own responsibilities. The citizen must play their roles by choosing what they are buying, the sustainable product that cannot destroy our nature, that cannot harm the right of the peoples. They can take their power to vote for the right peoples who are protecting our nature, to do not vote for those who have the ambition of 5 years, not far from the 5 years, to choose those who can really take us in a long-term pathway or together. As Indigenous peoples, we are doing our roles. We will be always fighting to protect our Mother Earth. We use our knowledge. We go outside to the international stages. We are doing it. Support us. Take our voice out to the researcher and all the people who got the science. Use the right science who can give equity and justice and access to all the developed and developing nations. Use this knowledge with the traditional knowledge of the Indigenous peoples to build a right solution. So we have the hope, we have the window. We can do it only if we can work all together and very fast enough.